Welcome back. We're talking about China and President Xi Jinping's foreign policy initiatives. Joining us here in Washington is Gregory Poling. He heads the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. With us from Beijing is international relations expert Victor Gao. Also joining us here in Washington from George Mason University and government and politics professor, of course, Ming Wan. And with us from Singapore is Lim Tai Wei. He is with the East Asia Institute of the National University of Singapore. Thanks so much for staying with us. Greg, I want to come back to you on what Ming Wan was saying before the break. There seems to be a push, obviously, for China to strengthen its relations with its ASEAN neighbours, but there's also the middle of a US rebalancing pivot to Asia. How does all this play out?
Well, I think that what we're seeing are, for the most part, ASEAN states wanting to avoid having to make that choice. There is no China choice versus U.S. choice to them. It is about maintaining their own independence of movement, independence of foreign policy. For instance, on the Vietnam visit, I think you saw that with the fact that, yes, it was an historic visit by President Xi, but as soon as he left, Japanese Defense Minister Gen Nakatani came in for 2 days. Not in a snub, but in a statement from Vietnam that we have a multi-directional foreign policy.
Everyone's talking to everyone.
Yes, and we're going to keep doing that. We're not going to become overly dependent either economically on China or politically or security on the U.S.
Interesting, Vietnam, signatory of the TPP, the US-backed trade pact, but also signing all these deals on the One Belt, One Road. Can they do both?
I think they can. One is very much about the infrastructure they desperately need. The U.S. is no longer good at these big infrastructure projects.
Hence the Asia infrastructure investment.
Exactly. Yeah. U.S. companies do not have the ability to come in and invest. You know, there's no new Marshall Plan for Asia. What U.S. can do is help on the trade front, trade and services, setting the rules of the road on things like labor. So I think Vietnam sees advantages to both. And most of Asia, I think, will eventually decide to pursue both.
Lim Tai Wei in Singapore, this is a sentiment that Singapore has said a lot about ASEAN, wanting to remain independent in terms of its foreign policy, in terms of where it is as a 10-nation grouping, very different countries. So how did the Chinese visit to Singapore fit in with that?
I think ASEAN is based on consensus amongst the 10 nations. Is based on a grand consensus amongst them. And Singapore, as one of the 10 nations, plays a very important role in striking this consensus and negotiations and compromises between the needs of the diversities of nations that's present in ASEAN. And so Singapore, in that role, has been a neutral platform. As demonstrated in the recent visit, it becomes a neutral platform
the Switzerland
for
of Asia,
two leaders on the cross-strait relations who have not met for 66 years. And it's going to be the same role that it will play in ASEAN as a neutral platform for different needs of different big powers in the region. As you have mentioned, U.S. is pivot back to East Asia. In fact, most ASEAN countries do not consider U.S. to have been away in the first place. U.S. is very much an integral part of this Pacific region, and so is Japan, which has set up its production network in the region for the past few decades. And China, especially with its connectivity and its ability to deliver infrastructural development, will also be an important player in the region. So ASEAN has the capacity to work with all these big partners, and also not forgetting India and Australia. So all these big players will have a role to come into ASEAN as it tries to forge a 500 million strong consumer market, as its many countries require a hard physical infrastructure for connectivity. And so China has a role to play, and so do all the other countries which have traditionally been around for a long time in various capacities, in defense, military, security, and also economic development.
Victor, I'm going to bring you in from Beijing here because President Xi has detailed a four-point plan in how China is going to cooperate with its neighbours. Just briefly talk us through that, and what's the reception been like on his trips to ASEAN countries and others?
Well, first of all, as far as China is concerned, ASEAN is very important for many reasons, trade and commercial relations, but also there is undeniably the fact that in many ASEAN countries, there are very large ethnic Chinese communities which have kept over the years or decades very close economic and family ties with their counterparts in mainland China. And we do, treasure these very special relations very much, almost without any exception throughout the ASEAN countries. I think more investments from the United States, Japan, China, Australia, India, and many other countries, EU, into the ASEAN region will be welcomed by China. The more, the better. And I think China's focus on providing better access through infrastructure and connectivity will only make sure that the ASEAN countries and people in ASEAN countries can benefit more and will get more value for the goods and services that they can export to other parts of the world. What China is worried about is that outside forces may want to insert itself or themselves into the ASEAN framework, and with some kind of not very well-defined objectives. If you look at the ASEAN region over the past several decades, ASEAN region is one of the very few peaceful and stable regions in the world, very different from many parts in Africa or in the Middle East, for example, or even in certain parts of Europe. And I think we need to work collectively very hard to keep the peace and stability in the ASEAN region rather than having them damaged or eroded or even destroyed if, for example, outside forces want to seek their own strategic goals at the expense of peace and stability in this region.
Ming Wan, outside forces inserting themselves, do you see what the US has been doing in the South China Sea as stirring up waters within ASEAN?
And as Dr. Li said earlier, the US has been an integral part of the Asia Pacific on so many dimensions, and there are also other players. And East Asia, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia together has been an important region in the global economy. Is growing, and there's a lot of trade flowing from East Asia to all places in the world. So lots of countries have a huge stake in this. And my own view is that in the South China Sea is a very important issue, and all parties that have a stake, have a role to play.
Well, President Xi, when he was in Vietnam, made a point of stressing freedom of navigation, Greg, because this has been a big issue between Washington and Beijing, and so there's been no evidence that what's happening there has any issues of freedom of navigation. Do you think that message came across?
Vietnam has been more quiet in public than, say, the Philippines or Australia or Japan after the navigation operation, freedom navigation operation that the U.S. Conducted last month. But it's been very supportive in private, and the statement it's made in public suggests that it is on board, but it doesn't want to poke China in the eye. So I don't think that message is going to get across in a Hanoi that, frankly, is still quite upset and has been since last May over China's actions.
And the U.S. President Barack Obama's headed to the region, Philippines.
Yes.
Do we expect more tensions because of that?
So far, we've seen indications that this isn't going to be a major issue at the APEC summit in Manila. It's going to be talked about on the sidelines. There's no avoiding that. And what we'll probably see when President Obama lands in Manila is that he and President Aquino will have their meeting Wednesday morning, and they'll probably be holding up a new enhanced defense cooperation agreement, a 10-year agreement for greater U.S. access to the Philippines. So that might throw a wrench into things. But I don't think it's going to blow up in Manila. But then we go to Kuala Lumpur shortly after for the U.S.-ASEAN Summit, the ASEAN Summit, the East Asia Summit, and there it's going to be a central focus of discussion.
Yeah, it's quite incredible the amount of diplomacy going on in the region. I want to end with Victor Gao because President Xi Jinping has traveled a lot in the last year. Is this a different style that we've been seeing from this Chinese president in terms of engaging with the international community?
Definitely, I think President Xi Jinping has set his own style and put his own fingerprint on China's diplomacy, and he has also brought a very new and reinvigorated, approach to China's international affairs, and I think is more hands-on. He asks all the details, for example, and is well prepared. And he has his own vision as to where China should stand on matters of principle and where China can be flexible. And in not only dealing with major powers like the United States, but also in dealing with our close neighbors in the ASEAN region. And I think that people in China really support President Xi Jinping, and we are very happy that we have this strong and very disciplined and very vigorous top leader leading the Chinese nation into the coming few years, and also well redefining China's role and international responsibility on the global stage. So I hope, he will be a strong force for peace and stability, but also a very, very formidable force in defending the national interests of China.